The second aspect of working class activity in 1905 was how the strikes were run, because they were run not so much by trade unions, but by Soviets, councils. And these councils were elected by workers for workers. Yes, socialist intellectuals rushed to Russia and tried to take participation in them. And in the St. Petersburg Soviet of 1905, Leon Trotsky managed to get momentary fame as the lead of that council. But he was only head of that council right at the very end in the final week. Up until that point, it was workers themselves that ran the Soviets. So it was the working class in the major urban environments that were running the show, and they were running it themselves through their own elected bodies. And in a place like St. Petersburg, the capital, by the late summer of 1917, many people consider it is the Soviet that is running the capital rather than the government. Now, this is beginning to look like a shift of power, and the regime is so worried by this that none other than the Prime Minister, Sergei Witte, calls a meeting with the leaders of the Soviet to try and argue through what they need. What demands do you have? How can we come to a resolution of this conflict? Now, this doesn't become dual power as in 1917 between the Provisional Government and the Soviets, but this is a remarkable turnaround. January 1917, the Tsar refuses to see anybody. The summer of 1917, his Prime Minister is in negotiations with the leader of the Soviets. So, working class activity and the nature of that working class activity is one very important feature of the 1905 revolution. Second, the countryside. The Russian Empire is predominantly an agricultural empire. The vast majority of its citizens are peasants. The people who go into the armed forces are taken predominantly from the countryside. So if the countryside is in revolt, then the regime is really in trouble. It's in trouble because this is the very nature of the regime's people, the peasants, but also because the peasants are depended upon for law and order. If you can no longer recruit amongst the peasants for your army, then what type of army have you got? You can no longer guarantee the security of state. In 1905, we see various types of peasant protest taking various forms in different parts of the empire. In parts of the empire where peasants are largely hired labour, the demand is for wages to be raised. In parts of the empire where peasants are predominantly their own farmers, but they suffer from land hunger, the demand is for more and more land. So peasant demands do change depending upon the location and the circumstances of those peasants. What's also interesting in certain parts of the empire is that those demands are coupled with political programs for the right to vote for peasants, the right for peasant representation in politics, the so-called peasant union movement. What's also interesting about peasant disturbances is they do not happen simultaneously across the empire. That when southern peasants are in revolt, northern and western and eastern peasants are quiet, and vice versa. The peasant protest seems to move around at different times, taking the different forms that it does. But nevertheless, in 1905, I think we can identify a new willingness among peasants to revolt, and their revolts do take new forms, in particular the peasant union and the politicisation of peasant protest. Maybe this is a sign that they are becoming modern citizens rather than ancient peasants. A third aspect of the 1905 revolution ties again into a very important feature of late imperial Russia, and that is Russia as empire. The fact that there is a various mix of ethnic groups in this empire in which Russians, ethnic Russians, are less than 50% of the total population. The impact of the nationalities in 1905 is to make any disturbance more radical. to make any violence more violent. 1905 is a very important point in the development of national movements across the Russian Empire. In Finland, we see a very important movement for national autonomy. And indeed, in 1905, a Finnish parliament is granted with legislative rights. It's also very important in the Baltic and in southern Russia as well. And in certain parts of the empire, we see the national movements not only fighting against the Tsarist authorities, we also witness them fighting against one another. So that in the Baltic, there are Baltic peoples and German peoples, and they have disputes. In southern Russia, we see people of Azerbaijan and people of Azeria fighting one another, Christians and Muslims. So wherever there are national movements, it makes violence more violence, but that violence is not only directed against the Tsarist state, it's often directed against competing national movements. And that, in a sense, can help the Tsarist state, because when nationalities become divided, then their force against the Russian state itself becomes weaker. A fourth aspect to the 1905 revolution, a final element I want to draw out in terms of what happened in 1905, is mutinies in the army and in the navy. The soldiers had quite a lot to complain about. There was the issue of discipline in the army, the fact that ordinary soldiers were shown no respect by their superiors. Then there were problems over supply and food, not having sufficient munitions in which to go into battle. And as the course of the Russo-Japanese War became worse and worse for the Russian forces, then it's precisely the people who are still not in the conflict, but who may be sent to the conflict, soldiers garrisoned near towns, or navy people who are still in port, who have a reason to revolt. Because the last thing they want is to receive orders to be sent off to the war. And one of the most famous revolts in 1905 was on board the battleship Potemkin, off the port of Odessa in southern Russia. Now, this did not finish the regime. The regime still had sufficient troops loyal to it in 1905 that it did not fall from power. But it did reveal particularly worrying and troublesome fault lines within the armed forces in 1905. The regime could not be convinced at all times that all units would be loyal. So we see different forms of the 1905 revolution in the urban environment, in the countryside, amongst the national movements, in the army and the navy. These things never come together simultaneously to topple the regime. But the 1905 revolution did have particular consequences for Tsarism. What were these consequences? Firstly, I'd say most importantly, the establishment of constitutional Russia. How did the Tsar manage in 1905 to bring these revolutionary outbursts to an end? He did it through concession. The October Manifesto issued on 17th of October 1905. And what this manifesto did is it gave in to the populist demands of the workers, the peasants and the liberal elite. It promised Russia an elected assembly whose authority had to approve any law in the Russian Empire. No longer would the Tsar be a legislative autocrat. The people would have to approve any legislative initiative. This was sufficient to buy the support of the people. And even though its promises were qualified 1 year later in the fundamental laws, Henceforth, the Tsar would have to live with a parliament. The Duma was a reality of the Russian political landscape. And if we follow events through to 1917, it's precisely out of the Duma that the post-Tsarist politicians come. It is the Duma, more than anything else, that arranges the revolution in February 1917. So constitutional Russia is a very important consequence with long-term implications for Tsarism. A second consequence was that Russia did not escape violence after the October Manifesto. That, if anything, once the regime had solidified itself through its concessions, it then took revenge on Russian society for the violent outbursts of 1905. The new Prime Minister, Peter Stolypin, is famous for his attempts to reform Russian agriculture. He was also known at the time for what were called Stolypin neckties. What the Stolypin neckties were was the summary hanging of people in villages across Russia for the outbursts of 1905. And these continued through 1906 and 1907. State-sponsored violence against mutineers, to restore control, to teach villagers a lesson that you should not revolt against your betters. In 1905 in the countryside, one of the institutions that had often been seen as a force for conservatism, a force for law and order, was the peasant commune. One of Stolypin's famous legislative acts was the attempt to replace the commune. The reason he got the green light from the Tsar for this legislation was because the commune had shown itself not to be a reactionary institution, but a revolutionary institution. So a very important consequence of 1905 was the impetus it gave to the state to try and do away with the Russian peasant commune. A third consequence in terms of policy influences not the regime itself, but right-wing forces outside the regime. One of the movements in 1905 that emerged to support the Tsar was the so-called Black Hundred movement. In the immediate years after 1905, not only does the regime take revenge against people, but so does the Black Hundreds. And this is with implicit support from the government. It's never given explicitly, but with implicit support. And the people who suffer most here are the Jews. Jewish communities in the Pale of Settlement with Black Hundred pogroms organised against them. So, in the aftermath of 1905, we don't see a settled Russia. We see a Russia that is still beset by serious problems of political violence from groups that are outside the control of the regime. And this is not healthy for the establishment of the first consequence of 1905, the constitutional Russia that I've mentioned. A final group that we might want to look at in terms of consequences is the opposition more broadly defined, the socialists. They had lost 1905. There was an attempt at a revolutionary transfer of power in Moscow in December 1905. And this failed, and it was quite a bloody failure. But one thing that 1905 did do was it gave Russian socialism new hope. It made it famous internationally. It made the party rethink its tactics. It made intellectuals think about unity rather than disunity. It ensured that Russia had a new identity, not of a place of reaction, but of a place of revolution. So that in the movement of change from the old world of capitalism to the new world of communism, who would have thought that at the very forefront of that movement would be Russian socialism?